소개하겠습니다. 연설자로는 제이커브 펑크 키르케고르 미국 피터슨국제경제연구소 이상임 선임연구원께서 수고해 주시겠습니다. 키르케고르 연구원은 유럽, 미국뿐만이 아니라 전 세계 사회 구조와 경제 정책, 인구 문제 등을 연구 중이시며 최근 한국의 인구 감소 상황에도 깊은 관심을 보여주셨습니다. 인구 데드크로스는 한 해 태어나는 아이 수보다 사망하는 사람 수가 더 많은 상황을 일컫는데요. 바로 우리나라가 직면한 문제이죠. 이미 연간 사망자 수가 출생아 수를 넘어선 지금 이를 극복할 현명한 방법이 필요합니다. 아이가 태어나지 않는 나라, 대한민국의 미래를 바꿀 방법은 과연 무엇일까요? 키르케고르 연구원께서 전해주실 한국 인구 문제 배경과 이를 해결할 수 있는 방안에 대해서 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 그럼 제이커브 펑크 키르케고르님을 무대 위로 모시겠습니다. Dr. 키르케고르, please come to the stage. 큰 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다. Please give him a big hand.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you first of all to Ideilli for inviting me today and for putting on this event. Because I mean, I'm an economist. I speak about a lot of different things, but it is rare that you get to a country like South Korea, where we like to say the demographics is not always destiny. But in the case of South Korea, as several of the keynote speakers already said, it might very well be. So I'm going to give you a lot of data today as we go through my presentation. And what you will see is a very interesting analytical event today. Namely that South Korea is in many ways sort of a country of extremes. You will see in all the data charts that I have, either South Korea is right at the top or right at the bottom. And that mixed together gives you the demographic outlook that South Korea has today. And this is a big deal, because South Korea will not have the luck of Japan first. Japan got through its demographic transition. Obviously, it started about 30 years ago, but it happened right at the time when Japan's big neighbor, China, started to boom. South Korea will not have that luck. China isn't going to boom for the next 30 years when South Korea goes through its demographic transition. And it's also, I think, very important to understand that, look, this isn't over the horizon. This isn't the future, this is today. It may well be, there's a lot of the charts that you will see that has projections, 2050, 2070, but the economic effects of that are today. Because as I'm sure all the business people in the room today, when you make investment decisions about the future, you look at those charts as well. And your investments today are driven by the projections for 2050 and 2070. So the economic effects of all the projections are actually happening as we speak. So basically, we're going to talk a little bit about debt cross. I want to show you what a debt cross is and what it means. Then the short to medium term outlook for population, which is basically immigration policy. Then the long term outlook for population, which is basically two things, namely deaths and births. Now deaths, that's pretty certainty in life, and we shouldn't expect that big of a change in the future, I'm afraid. So really what drives it is fertility, which of course in the case of South Korea is a very interesting analytical question. And then at the end I want to come with some credible policy options for what South Korea can actually do. Not to solve this, as was already mentioned, but at least to alleviate the effects. So, this is a debt cross. This is basically, the green line is births, and the red line is deaths. And what you can see here is from 1970 to 2070. Basically, it's a mirror image. The cross happened in the case of South Korea in 2020. And what you will see is basically that they look pretty much the same. It's a mirror image, as I said. Which means that all the benefits that South Korea had from rapid population growth until 2020, or the first part of the century, will probably be reversed in the second part. And this will undoubtedly have, in these potentially very negative effects on economic growth. Now basically, population change tends to be basically two things in analytical terms. It is the change in the natural change in population, that is the yellow bars here, which is basically births minus deaths. And then it is net migration, which is the green part of the bars here. And what I think the key point here to see is obviously the population, the natural population change in Korea declines, true in pretty much every country, and then it drops to negative in 2020. But the good news here is really, I would argue, that the green lines, with the exception of the COVID period, which was of course particularly difficult, is a significant positive contribution to the population outlook for South Korea. So if you take a look, this is basically looking at, in a little bit more detail, at what the net migration in South Korea is. And here you can sort of break them out between the migration that happens by South Korean nationals. They come and they go. And that, of course, of foreign laborers coming and going to South Korea. And what you can basically see here is that up until the great global financial crisis in 2008, there was net immigration by South Koreans. They tended, on average, to leave the country. Well, that stopped. Then it was basically flat, the yellow bars here, up until COVID. Then a lot of South Koreans came back to South Korea during 2020. And then that has somewhat normalized since in 2022 on the latest data here. But the really interesting one, I would argue, now there is a certain set of economic policies and incentives that governments can put in place that is particularly relevant for nationals or the local population, but really immigration policy is about the blue lines here, which is that of foreigners coming to South Korea. And this is just basically, as you can see here, South Korea has had net migration inflows of foreign laborers for pretty much the last decade, again if you ignore the COVID period, of about 100,000 a year. That is not, for a population the size of Korea, about 50 million, that is not particularly large in international comparisons, but it is not zero either. And it is certainly a very significant positive economic contribution to the national economy. So if you break out this a little bit, this is a chart that shows you the number of incoming foreigners to South Korea since 2000 by the type of visas. And the one I would particularly like to highlight are the ones here at the bottom, the red, the pink, and the blue, because they are essentially work visas, unskilled visas, business visas, and then the purple bar here is education, is student visas, etc. And that has, as you can see, been rising over time. Not very fast, but relatively steady. And I would certainly contend that in the future, the red bar, quote-unquote unskilled labor in South Korea, will likely have to increase quite significantly. And the reason for that is basically that as the population ages, there will be a significant need for care staff to take care of the elderly population. I would also contend that South Korea should work hard to increase both the pink part, which is basically high-skilled workers and business visas, but perhaps even more so the purple part, which is foreign students coming to South Korea. Now, in immigration terms, this really matters, and I speak from experience as someone who came from, I'm originally Danish, but I went to the United States to study, and then I worked there for over 20 years. So the real key here is to attract foreign students with having good universities, and then offer them opportunities to stay and work in the national economy. That's certainly what these charts suggest has been happening slowly in South Korea, but certainly, I would argue, not nearly to the degree that is necessary. But that is not, these are possible solutions, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. This is a chart that shows the projections from the Korean Statistical Agency between now and 2070 for the working age population in South Korea. And these charts, you see all the different lines here. These are all the different scenarios that the demographers estimate. And what you can see is that even the most positive scenario, where you have high net migration, high fertility, and low mortality, which is the blue line here, you project a decline in the working age population in South Korea by over 40%. Now, if you take the worst one, which is the red one here, it's over 60%. And then I just put in here, just for comparison's sake, the yellow line, the dotted line, which is Japan after 1997, when its working age population began to decline. And you can see that even in the most optimistic scenario, South Korea's decline will be twice the speed of Japan after 1997. And it's important to recognize that the blue line here, as I said, assumes high net migration of about 100,000 per year, which is basically what South Korea had, as you saw in the previous chart, between 2008 to when COVID hit. So even in that scenario, twice the decline of Japan. So there's no sugarcoating this. This is going to be bad. This is going to be a very significant negative impact. And what we're really trying to do here is to avoid the worst outcome. So, the long-term outlook. As I said, I think the long-term outlook in policy terms is really about fertility. Deaths, there isn't that much we can do about it. They can go up. We saw that obviously, unfortunately, in many countries during COVID. But ultimately, what can change is fertility rates. But, again, we shouldn't pretend that South Korea is not an outlier here, because it is. South Korea here is the red line. And as you can see, it declines to the lowest level in any OECD country by a significant margin. In fact, the only countries, quote-unquote countries, that have levels that are similar to South Korea are some of the big city-states, or whatever we choose to call them in Korea, in Asia, in Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore. Interestingly enough, actually, if you look at China, if you threw in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, etc., they would be on comparable levels to Hong Kong. The difference in fertility rates between Seoul and Beijing is not very big. But the interesting thing here is actually, in my opinion, the green lines here. Because here, that is the lines of all the countries, all the high-income countries in the world, the history of that have had significant rebounds in fertility rates of more than 0.4. Now, I picked that relatively randomly, but the point would be that this would be the equivalent for South Korea of where South Korea is right now, which is about 0.8, to where Japan is, which is roughly 1.2. So these are the only examples among high-income countries where you over time have had an increase in fertility rates, roughly to bring a country from where South Korea is today to where Japan is today, which is hardly a great place to be. And as you can see visually, yes, they tend to start going up a little bit, but it's not like they go rapidly up or anything like that. So we should be careful with assuming that you can just reverse, change, dramatically shift fertility onto another trajectory. History suggests otherwise. The rest of the world suggests otherwise. So again, we shouldn't pretend that the policy challenge in front of South Korea is going to be easy. It is not. And there's a couple of other things that are particularly relevant in the case of South Korea. This is the population pyramid, and unsurprisingly, you can see that it gets very, very narrow at the bottom. But I also put in here the gender differentials between South Korea and between the genders in South Korea. And what, of course, you can see here is what is abnormal is the category is the gray part of the bars here, which is that right now South Korea is going through a particular period where the gender imbalance in Korea is at its peak precisely at the age groups of the highest fertility levels, which is typically the late 20s and 30s. Now what that means is actually terrible, not only for men who like to go on a date and get married and all of that, there's a particularly intense marriage market mismatch in South Korea right now, but it also means that normally when you talk about sort of replacement rates, the level of fertility that keeps the population steady, we usually think that it's 2.1. Well, that assumes that there's gender balance. There is not in South Korea. So right now, for the last 5 years and the next 10 years or so, replacement rate fertility in South Korea is probably not 2.1, but say 2.3, because of this gender imbalance. So in some ways, the hill that South Korea is trying to climb is even higher than what normally would be assumed. So, one of the things that really sticks out, as I said, South Korea is either at the very top or the very bottom of all data that is relevant for fertility rates. And one of the ways in which South Korea is certainly an outlier relative to many, virtually all other advanced economies, is the number of children born out of wedlock. And as you can see, South Korea is right at the one end at only about 3%, a level only matched by Turkey and Japan. Everybody else is much, much, much higher. And then, now there's typically a lot of political insinuations by children born out of wedlock, that it's somehow assumed to be, somehow assumed to be representative of social decline or things like that, single parenthood and what have you. But typically in advanced economies today, that is not what it's about. What it is about is that it's typically couples that live together, but that for various reasons don't want to get married, but they are a nuclear family. There is a mother and a father, or two parents, etc. They just tend to have children before they get married. Now what that means is that family formation tends to happen earlier, and as we will see in pretty much every country in the world, we'll go to that later. So it delays family formation in South Korea. And that is obviously in fertility level terms bad. Because if you only start having children in your mid-30s, the probability that you will have 3 is close to 0. So this is a striking feature in South Korea, and one that I would argue is related both to legal issues, but more than anything, social norms and the like. And it is particularly in South Korea, it's an issue because the propensity to marry in South Korea has declined so much, which is the green bars here. As you can see, there's a relatively steady level of divorces. In South Korea, there's a little peak around the time when the law was changed, but the real big shift is the decline in the green bars. Well, that's a big issue. If you only have children in South Korea when you are married, basically, and then if people don't get married, well, they don't have children, on average. So if you don't address this issue, you're going to be in trouble. What is the outcome of this? Well, it means that South Korea today is the country in the world that has the highest average age of childbirth. As I said, in quantitative terms, that's really bad, because it means that the probability to have more than one child drops very significantly. So that is something that South Korean society, in my opinion, will have to address. And it's particularly, there are many reasons for that. Now, one of the other striking features about South Korea in analytical terms is that, look, South Korea is the country in the world, with the best educated young women. You know, 76% of 25 to 34-year-old women in South Korea graduate from university. Unprecedented in virtually every other country. But potentially, I would argue, this leads to the risk of delayed family formation, because if you don't get married when you are at university, if you don't have children when you're at university, it tends to be postponed quite significantly. Now, this is not something that South Korea should change. I'm certainly not advocating that the number of share of women in South Korea that get a tertiary education should decline. On the contrary, what obviously needs to happen, which is what happens in most other countries, high-income countries, is that the circumstances in which women go to university in South Korea should also be, you should be able to combine. You should actually be able to do both things. Have a family while going to university. So this is another very bad economic chart for South Korea. So this is essentially plotting the female labor force participation by age group across time. Each of those times, what you can see is at the left side, your right side, your left side, it rises very dramatically as women graduate from university. It peaks when women are 25 to 29-year-old, but then it declines. It's what demographers call it the M-shaped labor force participation. It declines again during the peak fertility years. That is a very, very bad outcome. And the reason for that, of course, is that why would you want the best educated women in the world to drop out of the labor force? Terrible outcome, terrible outcome for that to happen. And the question, of course, is why? Well, then many people would say, well, that has to do with the fact that there's not enough childcare, etc., and the government should spend more money, etc. Well, I would say it is not obvious that the South Korean government spends or doesn't spend enough money on early childhood education and care. So this is the share of GDP spent on those tasks from 0 to 5 years. South Korea is the red line. And interestingly enough, you may have heard that in Japan they had this thing called Abenomics, Womenomics, or whatever they choose to call it. And then you can see an increase in Japan, there's the yellow line here, after 2014. But on this issue, South Korea was way, way ahead of Japan. Right? It started already in the early 2000s. South Korea is maybe not at the levels of European welfare states, but it's certainly well ahead of Japan and well ahead of most other Anglo-Saxon countries. So it is generally not true that South Korean government is not spending enough on this, and that the government needs to spend more. Not obvious that even if it did, it's not clear that it would be that effective actually. It is also an interesting thing is this is a chart that shows the enrollment rate of young children by age group. The blue triangles are 0 to 2, and then 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And as you can see, South Korea is out there on your right. You will see that it is not clear, it is not obvious that South Korean children do not attend early childhood education, or basically are put in public institutions, relative to other countries. It's pretty much the same rate. So again, does this explain why this would suggest that there would be no particular reason why South Korean women dropped out of the workforce? Right? Why would they do that if nearly 100% of the children anyway go to public child care facilities? Which, by the way, is what happens in other countries, where this difference, where female labor force participation doesn't decline as motherhood ensues. And it was mentioned earlier that South Korea has very, very high costs, out-of-pocket childcare costs, education costs. Now, they may be high in South Korea, no doubt about that. But what this chart will tell you is it is not at all obvious that they are very high compared to other countries. In fact, what this chart tells you, South Korea is here. And the net total cost is the height of the blue bar. That actually, compared to other countries, South Korea is not that high. So thinking that this is all about reducing the total cost of out-of-pocket education costs is going to solve the problem, probably not. So there are probably other issues. And I would contend that one of the issues in South Korea that relates to particularly the marriage issue as well. This is a chart that shows you the gender distribution of who does household work among high-skilled workers, household workers. And what you can see out here is that in South Korea, the breakdown is terrible. On average, South Korean women does 85% of household. And by the way, remember, this was the best educated women in the world. 85%, 5 times as much as men. Far, I mean, obviously, ideally, you'd be close to 50. Now, nobody is at 50, but there's a number of countries that get pretty close to it. I would contend that these are the issues that South Korea needs to work on, more than anything else. Another example, this is a chart that shows you the employment gap in South Korea. This is some work that I did with my colleagues Karen Dynam and Stansbury last year. And basically the thing to understand here is the difference between the red and the blue dots. The blue dots basically show you that there's basically no difference between men, the labor force outcome of men and women without children. The red dots, however, suggest that women that have children have a much worse labor force attachment. And this is what this basically tells me, at least, is that we maybe shouldn't be so surprised, unfortunately, that the propensity to marry is declining. The propensity to have children in South Korea is declining. Why? Well, you have the best educated women in the world that do 5 times as much housework as men on average, and that if they have children, they suffer far worse labor force career hits. It's not a surprise, but it's very difficult to change. Credible policy options for South Korea here in the last couple of minutes that I have. Clearly, as I said, South Korea needs to expand further the inflow of migrants. And I would particularly say lower skill categories, and you need to really facilitate foreign students staying in Korea after graduation. It's also, I think, necessary to certainly remove all legal and administrative obstacles for children to be born out of wedlock. There can be no difference when you register for childcare or anything like that. You need to be able to do it with only one parent. The idea that you need 2 parents for those kinds of registration is a bad idea because it causes people to postpone it, to postpone family vacation. There might also be a case for subsidized housing. It was previously mentioned that in some OECD countries you actually have declining tax rates depending on how many children you have. But in the case of South Korea, maybe there is a case if you have a certain number of children, particularly if you have the 2nd or 3rd child, which typically tends to mean you need to move to a bigger apartment or bigger housing. Or maybe there is a case for public policy to subsidize that for those families. Because one of the interesting things, of course, in Japan is that Japan's fertility rate began to decline, or population, etc., began to decline, but so did the housing prices. So housing prices was less of an issue in Japan, perhaps, than it would be in South Korea. Now I'm not necessarily saying that declining house prices is a good thing, but it certainly may be a good thing for this. Then there's part-time work, parental leave. This has to do with the type of labor market conditions that you have. There's no doubt that you need to have this facilitated in South Korea. You can make it mandatory that both men and women have parental leave. You can say, well, if men don't take it, then they lose it. So it needs to be both officially encouraged by the government, but also incentivized. It's easy to incentivize this kind of thing through tax provisions, particularly for small and medium-sized companies. But I think we also need to be honest with ourselves and say, look, there is a limit to what government policy can do to shift these types of things. And this is really more of a broadly societal mobilization that I think needs to happen in South Korea. Where I certainly think, and I think this is really why it's very important that companies like Idaily push this issue on the agenda, because I think the media has a big role to play here. It has to do with changing social norms. Well, how do you do that? Well, I think there is a big role to play here for media, for celebrities and others. You know, I mean, my favorite example is, like, take royal families in Europe. You think it's a coincidence that Prince William, they have 4 children? Most of the royal families in Europe have 3 and 4 children. Why? It's a good example. Take one of the most successful celebrities in the world, David Beckham. How many children? 4. The best basketball player in the world, LeBron James, who had children while he was playing peak basketball. 4 children. Those are the kinds of things and role models that the media needs to play up. And Korea is in a great shape, right? Korea has really strong K-pop, TV, etc., etc. These are the kinds of stories, models that needs to be promoted, that show that this is normal, that you can manage it, that it is socially prestigious to have 3 and 4 children. But then at the end here, I'll just say that, look, we shouldn't pretend that this will solve the problem. It will only make it less bad and mitigate the effects. So everybody needs to prepare for a world of fewer students, fewer workers, and fewer consumers. And I'm well over my time, so thank you very much.
좋은 영상을 고맙습니다.